Tonight, on a very special video games. Way back in the early aughts, a group in Dartmouth College sought to make a show with clones that got the MTV teen drama slot. Now this show is off the air now, a revival show is nigh. Recap, rant, review, and wrap up. Time to laugh and shiver and cry. Clone High originally aired on MTV back in 2002, but due to a combination of poor reviews and public backlash, ended its run after only airing a single season. Yet word of mouth and the Wild West age of internet piracy caused the show to garner a sort of cult following, culminating in talks of a revival series, just in time to enjoy the show's resurgence in mainstream culture through memes, mostly involving JFK. And of course it would have a resurgence. The show's fast tempo, snappy one-liners, and overall reliance on random humor predated the internet of the 2010s and rise of quick-paced Zoomer humor. That, on top of a surprising amount of historical accuracy for a show without leaning too heavily into the history aspect, meant that Clone High can really be considered a show ahead of its time. This retrospective will be split into individual episode reviews, which themselves will be divided into 4 sections: recap, research, review, and wrap-up. Recap is a short summary of the events of the episode. Research is any historical or cultural context for references, as well as any additional information that may not pertain directly to the episode, but still to the show itself. Review details the overall theme and how the episode fits into the larger narrative, and wrap-up is for anything I couldn't find another place for. But as a final bit of warning, my research rarely goes beyond reading the Wikipedia page on relevant world leaders. Since Clone High is more so about the cultural understanding of each historical figure than the actual hard history, this is typically sufficient enough, though expect to see a few pedantic details left out. Escape to Beer Mountain, a rope of sand. The clones are back at school, and to celebrate, JFK is throwing a rager. Everyone who's anyone is invited, which means Abe and Gandhi are not. At least not until Abe boldly volunteers to bring the beer, which gets him in. The catch is that he has to settle for non-alcoholic beer, as he's underage and his other plans don't work. Joan sets up a teen crisis hotline in order to impress Abe with her commitment to community service, and to hopefully draw his attention away from Cleopatra. Gandhi volunteers for the hotline on accident and ends up neglecting his responsibilities to attend the party anyway. Scudworth also crashes the party dressed as a teenager in order to better understand the students, so the board of shadowy figures doesn't kill him. In the end, the police show up to arrest the students for underage drinking, but when Abe sees his friends in the back of a cop car, decides to tell the truth, that the beer was all non-alcoholic. This ruins his reputation, but not so much that Cleo gives up on him entirely. Clone High was created by the duo of Phil Lord and Chris Miller, a duo that met back in Dartmouth alongside Bill Lawrence, who is better known for his work on Scrubs. Scrubs was actually in production at the same time as Clone High, and many of the voice cast of Scrubs can be heard doing small bit roles, such as the Extreme crew from Episode 2, being voiced by Sarah Chalk, Zach Braff, and Donald Faison, as well as including Neil Flynn as Glenn the Janitor, a reference to his other prolific role. In fact, much of the voice work was even recorded in North Hollywood Medical Center, where Scrubs was filmed. The art style of Clone High is heavily reminiscent of early aughts Cartoon Network programming, with the showrunners liking the snappy animation as it lent itself well to the quick-wittedness of the show's writing and helped to deliver punchlines. Characters and backgrounds were drawn with traditional animation techniques, and cells were commonly reused. The result is that very little action ever occurs in the viewer's peripheral vision, preventing the fast action from ever becoming too disorienting. The decision to use this episode's plot as the first is a curious one. While many other shows with serialized stories eschew developing character relationships until dynamics are already established, Clone High goes directly into developing the love triangle between JFK, Abe, and Cleo in an episode that seems to do more to establish characters than premise. If the show were more of a character drama than a comedy, this would be the norm, but in Clone High it seems to neglect the show's strong premise in favor of leaning heavily into the tropes it parodies instead. So rather than a show about clones of famous historical figures attending high school, it's a show about high school drama that just happens to have clones of famous historical figures in its cast. The first episode does very little to sell the show's conceit or potential for intelligent history humor, but this could just be my nerdy self looking at the show in a glass-half-empty kind of way. Episode 2, Election Blu-Galoo. JFK runs for student body president as a puppet for Cleo, who can't run herself due to term limits. Abe runs for student body president on behalf of Joan, although mostly to impress Cleo. He gets killed in the polls and decides to take on a corporate sponsor to bolster his numbers, which causes Joan to quit the campaign on principle, supporting JFK out of spite. The election comes to a head when Abe is about to do a final death-defying stunt, because that's what politics is, before Gandhi collapses due to malnutrition caused by constantly consuming the house paint branded as food that Abe was shilling. After Marilyn Manson does a song and dance routine about nutrition, the school decides to vote a puppy in as student body president instead. Ostensibly the main character of the show, Abraham Lincoln is an awkward and nerdy teenager overflowing with hormones and anxiety, so really an average high schooler, with the caveat that his anxiety comes in part from the pressure of living up to the real Lincoln. And you thought your parents had high expectations. While Lincoln is drawn to positions of political power, such as student body president, he only does so as a gambit to get into the pants of Cleopatra, though his commitment to do the morally righteous thing is something that still shines through at a rate of about once per episode. Of course, to portray Abe Lincoln as a depressed teenager isn't exactly a stretch of the real historical figure's personality, even if almost everything else about the youth is different. The real Lincoln was charismatic from an early age, noted by locals as dependable and humorous. A tall but strong youth, he even had a stint as a professional wrestler, and apocryphally invented the pile driver. But that sense of humor belied a deeper melancholy, literally diagnosed at the time as melancholy, an affliction that would later be named clinical depression. And close associates were even at one point wary of leaving the young man alone with any sharp objects. Having taught himself concepts like trigonometry and law as a result of limited formal schooling, Lincoln often described himself as a totally self-made man, the type to have grown strong from extreme childhood hardships, hardly comparable to nerves from asking out a popular girl. This episode had a much greater potential than it executed, mostly from the missed opportunity associated with two American presidents running against one another for a presidential position, but very little outside of vague references to their more famous quotes. There's a little bit said about elections in general, that the students are voting between a strong personality and a corporate sponsor. The winner is a dog who wandered on stage that ends up the way the other two candidates would have, a puppet for Cleopatra. In the end, very little changes and no character is ever really held accountable for their actions, just for moral failings. Nobody responsible for any actual damage is ever held accountable. Abe's ego and obsession with Cleo keeps him in the campaign, which drives him to get a corrupt corporate sponsorship. Joan damages Abe's campaign and drives him to more and more dangerous stunts, but in the end only has to make a grand gesture to get his friendship back. Cleo is the instigator behind everything, and she still gets exactly what she wants. Scudworth gets and then loses a bunch of money, with the narrative punishing him more for incompetence than anything he actually does with the cash. A.D.D. The last D is for disorder. Gandhi gets diagnosed with ADD and its hyperactive cousin, ADHD, which ostracizes him from the rest of the school as they're busy setting up for the school's awareness fair. Joan starts to hear religious voices in her head, leading her to declare that the Lord's intentions are to the world, though these mostly consist of repeating commercials, as her retainer is just picking up Christian radio waves. Scudworth wants to reconnect with the student body better, and reasons that Mr. Butlertron's sweater vest is the source of all the robot's charisma. Abe has to choose between spending time with the newly single Cleo as she sets up her kissing booth, or to help salvage the image of his best dude forever, Gandhi. In the end, he kisses Gandhi at the school's kissing booth, which is enough of a grand gesture that the mob decides hating gay people is better than hating Gandhi. Probably the most controversial depiction of a character in the show, Mahatma Gandhi is the fun-loving comic relief of the cast and a close friend of Abe's. Proclaimed by the showrunners as a party animal with a heart of gold, the character is cracked under the immense pressure of living up to the real Gandhi, and has instead regressed to a wisecracking spaz, hoping to secure affection through his antics rather than peaceful non-action. That's not to say that he shares no similarities to the original Gandhi, however. The clone is constantly shown to be active within the school's community, serving as the mascot and volunteering in a sense for Joan's teen crisis hotline, although in the latter case he abandons his responsibilities for a shot at acceptance from the mob. When JFK threatens him in one episode, Gandhi refuses to fight back, showing that the pacifism of his clone ancestor is still somewhere deep down within him. And at the end of the first season, he even declares his intentions to stay abstinent in his relationship with Marie Curie. He's also routinely shown to have a pretty decent grasp of people's feelings and emotions, fitting for a diplomat. Gandhi is one of the few characters overtly aware of Joan's crush on Abe, and he's regularly able to capitalize on trends in pop culture and media. There's a lot of potential to his character, held back by things like his ADD and thirst for affection. But if you were an awkward emotional teenager who had to live up to one of the most beloved stoics of history, you'd probably feel like a failure as well. Every episode of Clone High is a very special episode, and like many of the very special episodes of the past, have a tendency to say nothing and do that poorly. The true reason for this fact was that US law required children's entertainment to be wholesome to some degree, and have some kind of positive moral messaging. This often culminated in forced, and now you know, segments being pushed into the end of episodes, segments which were only loosely related to the plot, and that rarely had any actual value beyond keeping media watchdogs off of the studio's back. As a result, these very special episodes are remembered with a sense of ridicule, as even kids could tell when something was shoehorned into a plotline. If the writers had really meant to tackle an issue, they would have done so with a greater sense of intentionality. But this all works great for a comedy show. If you intentionally try to say nothing, you can create good parody without even having a definite punchline. Gandhi poking at his elbow skin and jumping out of windows is just a cherry on top of the sandwich. Film Fest: Tears of a Clone. In order to prevent another college-level riot, Clone High School runs a film festival that allows each student to create their own form of self-expression. Abe creates an incomprehensible story about a giraffe playing football. Joan creates an incomprehensible story about her love of Abe. Cleo creates a self-indulgent epic about herself. Gandhi works with George Washington Carver to create an exploitation buddy cop comedy. And JFK just uses the casting couch as an excuse to make out with as many women as he can. Meanwhile, Scudworth frets over a visit from the secret board of shadowy figures, and tries to make everything perfect. He fails until Butlertron charms them and they decide not to terminate Cinnamon after all. Terminate like kill, I mean. Film Fest: Tears of a Clone is the best look that we get at many of the side and background characters in the show. Ordinarily, these characters exist as nothing more than fodder for historical references, though occasionally these aren't so highbrow. Sometimes even within the same character. Catherine the Great can be called Catherine the So-So, and also be told to get off her high horse. A character named Jesus Cristo might impale himself with a nail gun, and then crack a joke about the Latin Grammys. Other references are more subtle, like Caesar pillaging a bunch of books during a riot, a possible Library of Alexandria reference. Actually, it kind of makes me wonder about some of the history behind the history. Caesar is shown to regularly be a part of Cleopatra's clique, but nothing is ever implied to have happened between the two of them, despite the relationship of their ancestors. Each student makes a film that best represents their character in the way that they see themselves. Cleopatra's film is a clear parallel to the 1963 film Cleopatra, a movie that was at once the highest-grossing film of the year, as well as a commercial failure, due to not recouping its exorbitant production costs. But it's not about the money for Cleo, nor is it even about releasing the film. The production itself is her gift to herself, meant to indulge her in an opportunity to laud some additional authority over others. Joan's film makes no sense to all the audience but Freud, but again, this was the intention. She worried that others might get it, but in the end, she's the type to enjoy that she can make something so esoteric. Like, if others know what she's saying, then her works are somehow lesser. Abe's film is incomprehensible in a similar way to Joan's, but for the opposite reason, as Abe was intending for the message to be much clearer. Gandhi creates a buddy cop movie rife with stereotypes that call back to blaxploitation comedies. Being one of the clones not to make a movie that's solely about himself separates him as an individual who really lacks the ability to stay in the spotlight for any longer than a quick gaffe. But whether this is due to anxiety or ADD, we never truly get an answer for. Personally, I think the Film Fest plotline should have been the first episode. Through each film's production, we learned so much about each member of the main cast, so much better than a simple character plot ever could have done. If a few character plots had been shuffled around between episodes, this would have been a much more impressionable first episode, better than even the real pilot, as there were quite a few more historical in-jokes this time around, though the show itself was still more of a showcase of pop culture than pop history. Sleep of Faith: La Rude Awakening. The PXJTs, equivalent to the PSAT, are coming up, and Abe pulls multiple all-nighters in order to help Cleo prepare. But all this studying is damaging his ability to focus on anything else, so Gandhi and Joan prepare an intervention for the boy, who neglects their advice so he can drag race JFK for Cleo's affection. While that's occurring, Gandhi decides that he's not going to take the test and live the education-free lifestyle of a trucker. But the trucker he apprentices under turns out to be the ghost of Jug Prep Course, and he learns a very important lesson, or something like that. Back at the drag race, Lincoln decides that he does have a problem and pulls over to take a nap, winning the race in a tortoise and hare style way. Mr. Butlertron dukes it out with an old foe in Scangrade, a giant robot who subsists off the lead from number 2 pencils in order to take over the world, or something. One of the most well-known episodes of Clone High, and also the one episode that probably has the least to do with the clones at all. It plays out more like a parody-style comedy than anything approaching a historical joke, the only one that pops into my head being JFK suffering an accident involving an open-roof vehicle. This joke is, of course, the joke from the show most people recognize. Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys. I've mentioned before in this video, and will probably mention again, that I'm a fan of pop history, and so the fact that the most memed scene from this episode is the one history joke is something of a justification for my opinions, but the overall show has still managed a cult following with its current balance. So while I polish my opinions throughout this video, please keep in mind that it's less of a firm pronouncement of how the show ought to be, and more pondering why it is the way it is. Sleep deprivation in this episode is meant to be a parallel to drug abuse in teen dramas. The very special episode framing the episode uses mirroring that of the drug episodes it parodies. Later on, we get an episode about smoking raisins that also parodies drug abuse PSAs, making this a topic that gets covered twice. That said, if there is one thing I remember about growing up in the 90s, it's the vast amount of anti-drug PSAs I sat through in school that never actually taught me anything about drug abuse. To the point that I spent years thinking that antihistamines and ibuprofen were evil, and you should just power through your allergies. Also, apparently that I'd be offered a lot of cough medicine randomly. Clone High not only parodies a lot of the TV shows of the 90s, but as a result of this, parodies many of the normalized behaviors of the 90s as well. Education for the sake of education, rather than for the sake of learning a skill set that makes you employable, women being won as objects in a drag race, and of course, the message of, avoid drugs kids, no, we won't elaborate. Homecoming, a shot in dark. Joan takes on the male persona of John Dark in order to play on the Clone High basketball team, as it doesn't allow girls or animals to play. She quickly distinguishes herself as the only person on the team who can shoot, much to the chagrin of Abe, whose MVP status was meant to impress Cleo. Cleo then becomes infatuated with the new MVP, as does JFK, who starts to explore feelings that make him uncomfortable. Gandhi and Genghis kidnap the mascot of genetically engineered Superhuman High, or Geshi, as a prank, only to realize that he's not a guy in a suit, but a real engineered creature. These plots all come to a head during the big game between CHHS and GESH, as both principals have a bet over Clone High scoring a single point. Cleo manages to score a free throw after revealing her identity, though Abe gets the credit. Joan is the angsty girl next door archetype so central to many teen dramas, doomed to forever be the backup plan of a male lead. The Betty to Cleo's Veronica, and yes, the showrunners are absolutely aware of that comparison, as is Joan. She resents many of the genre cliches that she's grouped into, and actively fights against them, much in the same way the original Joan of Arc did. Though the original Joan was inspired to fight through a combination of religious visions and her hometown of Doremi being destroyed during the 100 Years' War. The other comparisons are still ample. Joan even cross-dresses in this episode in order to lead the basketball team to victory, though her motives are still pretty distinct from her relatives. The original Joan of Arc believes herself to be a prophesied hero, meant to lead the French to a victory, and this lines up well with Joan's own insecurities, trying to live up to the tales of an older heroic figure. But the clone Joan takes these visions rather well. She's ecstatic at the idea of hearing religious voices in her head during one episode, hoping that it's her calling, when the reality is that her retainer was merely picking up radio waves. And Joan is always willing to be the bad guy socially, if it means helping those less fortunate out, mirroring the fact that the original Joan of Arc followed the callings of Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria, both of whom were martyred for their beliefs. There's something to be said for an individual who willingly follows her destiny in this way, knowing it should end so poorly. This episode is a parody of the old girls versus boys style episodes that proliferated in the 90s, similar to the other very specials that have been parodied so far. Typically, these episodes feature some sort of contest and some kind of character assassination, as they need the cast to suddenly be openly hostile towards the other gender. These sort of episodes tended to teach lessons that were the opposite of helpful, as they showed examples of overt discrimination instead of the type of sexism that's much more likely to happen in real life. People take a look at a female character who overtly hates all men and assume that's what a misandrist looks like, instead of a woman who turns up her nose at a father playing with his child at the park. But the real interesting part of this episode comes from the fact that we get to see other secret government super soldier projects that also happen to take the form of high schools. Clone High isn't the only organization doing the super soldier thing, and it's an interesting development that the show unfortunately never gets to do anything with. Granted, this is a show where a robot planned to take over the world by collecting pencil dust from number 2 pencils, so it's equally likely the showrunners weren't planning anything big in the first place. Plain Crazy, Gate Expectations. Cleo gets into a Canadian spring break dance show hosted by Ashley Angel from O-Town. She assures Abe it won't damage their relationship and promises she'll even wear his letter jacket as an assurance. But when the show airs and her arms are jacketless, Abe has a meltdown over her perceived infidelity. Gandhi becomes a rapping sensation when he realizes that his street name, G-Spot, rhymes with G-Spot. With the help of his manager, JFK, he's able to reach the top of the charts before realizing that he'll need more than one line to continue his career. Or will he? Scudworth chases after a skunk, horribly and repeatedly maiming himself in the process. In the end, it's revealed that Cleo was wearing the jacket all along, it had merely shrunk to the point that it fit around her neck. The popular chick of Clone High, Cleopatra very closely lives up to the legacy of her ancestor by having a strong diplomatic rule over the social hierarchy of her peers, manipulating others using her feminine wiles and charm to get her way. That said, we actually get very little characterization for Cleopatra as a clone. She exists largely as a fan service conduit and a trophy to be won in things like drag races and elections, though this is a role that she willingly plays. Of course, this is merely Cleo trying to live up to the idea of her ancestor rather than the actual history. The true Cleopatra was a skilled diplomat, fluent in several languages and able to survive in a family where death by assassination was a common affliction for anybody with power. Much of her power was derived from survival instinct, surrounded on all sides by political adversaries, both within and without her courts. She was forced to ally herself with the strongest among them in order to keep surviving and even thriving. If she can pass as a mere trophy wife or whoever is really in power, then it helps to preserve the image of herself as an unassuming and unmanipulative woman. I feel as though this entire episode was designed around trying to make the "don't get on that plane" gag as many times as possible. Everything else about it is just a receptacle for the type of nonchalant nonsense humor that the show, and Phil Lord and Chris Miller's careers in general, is so well known for. Canada being portrayed as this sunny, beach-filled paradise, teen dance shows taking chances on small, unknown artists, and the absurd cartoon violence of the skunk segments. I actually hate the Skunky Poo segments of this episode, far too happy tree friends for my tastes. It gets old after the first explosion, but then again, that is the point. It elicits the exact type of reaction that it's trying to create, and the fact that this sort of violence only shows up every so often instead of being a staple shows that the showrunners have the restraint not to lean too heavily into gore humor so often that it becomes tedious. Though in this episode I feel like they cut it pretty close. Raisin the Stakes, a rock opera in 3 acts. A musical episode where the students of Clone High go on a raisin-fueled rampage against the tyranny of their parents, who are trying to stop them from smoking raisins. All orchestrated by a mysterious character known as the Pusher. The entire ordeal is sparked when a stray comment from an anti-drug guest speaker, Larry Hardcore, convinces the whole school that raisins can not only be smoked, but that it's cool to do so. The PTA organizes to try to put a stop to the phenomenon, and Scudworth realizes that a group of scared, angry individuals make the perfect tools for manipulation. He convinces them to build a giant wall around something before Joan finds a solution to the whole issue. She gets the parents high on raisin fumes, so their children will decide that smoking isn't actually cool because authority figures are doing it. Meanwhile, Gandhi goes on a trip to slay an Aussie dragon and rescue a princess in order to be thrice slain. Being an MTV program in the 90s, Clone High was able to get an almost absurd level of celebrity casting for a show that remains so unheard of. Obviously, in this episode, viewers can recognize the vocal talents of Jack Black, but through the entire series we've seen so many bit roles from big-name celebrities that the list of cameos is almost a punchline in and of itself. I mean this in the sense that, while many animated properties will give front billing to a celebrity cameo, putting it in all their promotional materials, Clone High is content to give Michael J. Fox 3 words of dialogue where he plays a kidney. Or if the celebrity is name-dropped in the episode itself, about half the conversation surrounding them will be jokes at the celebrity's expense. I just reviewed BoJack Horseman, another show that does the same thing, and it's interesting to see that celebrities making fun of themselves is something that's been around for decades. The use of social pressure in this episode is something that gets explored from multiple angles, pointing out absurdities from every side of the issue. The most obvious of these comes from the initial peer pressure against Abe to smoke a raisin. This is what most people are familiar with, as it's what kids get warned about in school. It never sat especially well with me then, since the lesson seemed to be, at some point in your life all your friends will try to ruin your life. Anyway, Abe smokes raisins and then pretends to be high, just as everybody else is doing, because that's what they're told the raisins will do. Not overtly though. Larry Hardcore convinces teenagers to smoke by telling them that they shouldn't do it. Teenagers doing the opposite of what authority figures tell them to do is an established part of adolescence, and so characters in this story can use that to push an idea. Likewise, Joan is able to use the opposite type of influence to eliminate the raisin craze, showing that the PTA enjoys it as well and turning the kids off of the trend. It's like when your mom uses a meme so you know it's dead. Finally, there's one other type of social pressure exploited by Scudworth, that of anxiety. He's able to rile up the PTA into a fearful frenzy, then use that fear to make them easier to control. You really get the impression that this guy works for the government. All these groups get riled up against imaginary enemies. The students believe their parents are out to get them, but the parents only want to help. The parents view the raisins themselves as the enemy, when it's the societal expectation to fit in that's more to blame. And then the raisin industry itself is on standby, ready to profit off the situation in any way they can. A room of one's clone, the pie of the storm. Storms of ruin. Joan's house burns down in a lightning strike and she's forced to move in with Cleopatra, as their foster parents are dating. They're immediately at each other's throats, and so Lincoln attends a conflict mediation seminar so he might better learn to resolve interpersonal issues. Scudworth gets a robotic dog as a gift from the secret board of shadowy figures, but Butler Tron mistrusts the pooch and uncovers that it's actually a freelance agent spying on the principal. Gandhi and JFK begin fighting over who gets to ogle the girls until they have a 90s pillow fight, the girls I mean, before the fight spills out into the streets and intercepts the other ongoing plotlines. Finally, a newly inspired Abe convinces everyone to stop throwing things at each other and start throwing things at him instead. Principal Cinnamon J. Scudworth and Butler Tron are the duo who run Clone High on behalf of the Board of Shadowy Figures. And while Scudworth is planning to steal the clones away for his own designs, his intentions and incompetence are so thorough that this is more of a recurring bit than a plot point. Butler Tron is the voice of reason of the duo, and Scudworth is the comic relief, though this is a role that overlaps pretty heavily with so many other characters like Gandhi or JFK that his real purpose is more of a means for B-plots that piece together an overarching story involving the Board of Shadowy Figures. These B-plots often have more of a connecting thread than the episode's A-plot, which mostly exist for the sake of humor, and as a result he has the most real action in the story, preventing the show from being a loosely related series of cutaway gags. The dichotomy in this episode between the beginning and the climax is one that very well encapsulates how Clone High handles tone. We have an ominous foreboding storm coming into the town, and by the end there's a pie fight with the Benny Hill parody chase. The entire thing gets washed away in the end, as when the storm does show up it's as an instrument of conflict resolution rather than destruction as it first was. So through all of this framing we can see how Clone High uses not only elements of pop culture, but the tone many of these series had as well. The self-importance of a teen drama, acting like breakups and makeups are the most important thing in the world. Lincoln gets the most in touch with his inner clone self in this episode, something that felt like missed potential for the other clones to have done. All the characters feel some sort of anxiety about living up to their own name, and here we see Abe realizing that he's not the charismatic leader he's supposed to be, then trying to do something about it. Of course, this ends up failing due to the massive commodification of his likeness today, and so, ironically, the actual moral lesson he takes away from his journey of self-discovery ends up making him more relatable to the pop culture-addled people of his hometown. Litter kills. Literally. Juan Ponce de Leon, a real regular character, dies as a result of his littering habit, and JFK takes his passing poorly. As Cleo spends more and more time comforting JFK, Abe starts to feel resentment, as though the two may get back together. Joan eventually convinces Abe to help comfort JFK, saying it's what a good friend and good person should do, so Abe visits him at the thinking docks, and the two decide to get the group together to clean up most, of the school's litter. They're joined by Gandhi and a group of escaped prisoners, as Gandhi was thrown onto death row due to wearing an orange blazer and being confused as an escaped convict. While many clones lament their inability to live up to their original ancestor's reputation, JFK has a little trouble doing so. He's the smooth-talking womanizer of Clone High School, and is as popular with the ladies as he is with the fellas. But despite the outward appearance of a himbo, this actually obfuscates a much deeper personality, able to connect with Joan on a more emotional level after she's left by Abe, and managing to show a surprising vulnerability at many times, because JFK doesn't actually live up to the real Kennedy, only the cultural impact of the original JFK. We remember him as a womanizer who conquered the moon, rather than a diplomat who worked to ease tensions during the Cold War, and supported the ongoing civil rights movement. At least during his speeches. The real clone JFK is a guy who's well in touch with his feelings and quick to befriend others, regardless of their social status, such as when he and Gandhi become close friends, bonding over various things like their rap careers and objectification of women. This sensitivity is something that he has to actively repress, as it might damage the image of him as a spiritual successor to the real JFK. So while other clones are buckling under the pressure of not living up to the historical greatness of their ancestors, JFK is buckling under the pressure of living up to that idea too well. JFK gets the most character development in this episode of any character in the cast due to the passing of his close personal friend, but in typical Clone High fashion, this has to be done in the most tongue-in-cheek way possible. Often a character in a work of media will exist purely to be killed off so that another more important character can receive some development. In Clone High, this is done as overtly as possible. A new character gets introduced in the same episode he's killed off in order to fake an emotional beat, much in the same way many other shows that take themselves very seriously often do. Glenn the janitor in this episode is played by Neil Flynn, who you may recognize from that other Bill Lawrence show with the janitor character. Here, he has an implied ongoing feud with Scudworth, another on the list of character beats introduced for a single episode, that actually makes the intentional cop-out of this episode feel like an even more natural addition than many of the fridge characters of other dramas. This, in addition to Gandhi exploiting the animation tradition of having prison bars wide enough to see the character's face behind them to escape, give an overall edge to this episode's parody aspects that cause it to stand out as one of my favorites. Snowflake Day, a very special holiday episode. Gandhi and Abe are working degrading part-time jobs in order to save up money for the holiday spending season, but accidentally invent a rival product to the spork, the Nork, a fusion of knife and fork. They try to market the product throughout the mall, but mostly end up maiming Abe's face repeatedly. In the end, Abe decides to make a heartfelt handcrafted gift for Cleo instead, who rejects it as she was hoping for something expensive but useless, like a Nork. Joan has a case of the Grinch spirit, as she hates the corporatism of the politically correct Snowflake Day. She plans to sabotage the festivities, but is visited by a homeless woman who is possibly Mandy Moore, learning the holiday spirit from her. Though this is really just an excuse for the homeless to rob Cleo's house while everyone's in the basement. The character Gandhi drew some controversy, resulting in a hunger strike outside of Viacom's headquarters in India, when groups grew outraged at his depiction in Clone High. While it's common online to state that this was the reason the show was cancelled, the reality is that Clone High never really garnered much praise from reviewers in the first place, and it was underperforming in its time slot, even before the controversies really gathered much traction. Considering that Gandhi can appear as a warmongering nuclear enthusiast in the much more popular Civilization series without garnering much ire, it's not too likely that protesting groups in a foreign country could have had that much of an impact on the show's future. The showrunners have stated in interviews that if the show had continued on, they would have either written a second season without Gandhi, that included no allusion to the fact that he ever existed, or that he was actually a clone of Gary Coleman all along. Though both of these suggestions were shot down by executives. In the trend of parodying television cliches, we have the greeting card company holiday movie parody. Joan is rebelling against the rampant capitalism of what was supposed to be a religious holiday. Remember, her ancestor died as a martyr for Christendom, but is given an epiphany from those who cannot partake in the consumerism of the day, enjoying it nonetheless. This is, then, flipped on its head, when the entire moral was merely a scheme to steal material possessions from rich people. Gandhi and Abe, meanwhile, indulge in the consumerism of the season and try to strike it big, capitalist style. But they also end up taking the opposite approach and meet in the middle ground of enjoying the gift-giving spirit. Of course, this results in Abe buying Cleo a gift that he himself would have appreciated, while Cleo buys Abe something that's more similar to what she was looking for. The only people who manage to get most out of the holiday are JFK and Scudworth. These two both enjoy what we're shown as a tradition. Scudworth writes a Christmas letter narrating events with dubious relevance, while JFK puts out a Christmas album while laughing at gay lyrics. a tradition anybody who's been through middle school is no doubt familiar with. Makeover, Makeover, Makeover. The Makeover episode. Another prom is coming to Clone High, with the promposals getting increasingly elaborate as more and more students get more and more into the spirit, except for Joan, who can't get herself excited over seeing Abe and Cleo growing closer. But Abe misconstrues this as Joan being upset she doesn't have a prom date and decides she needs a makeover. Gandhi is also struggling, so JFK takes a bet against himself to see if he can't get the guy a date, but first, JFK decides that Gandhi needs a makeover. Scudworth is broken up by a call from his longtime rival, John Stamos, who stole the title of Prom King from him years and years ago. So the principal decides to rig the Prom King election so that he wins, and the first step of that plan is that he needs a makeover. Cleo hates hearing Joan cry about Abe's obliviousness, and the fact that her blind foster father decided she needs a makeover, and out of the newly acquired sensation of empathy she's feeling, decides that Joan needs a makeover. Like the teen dramas that Clone High parodies, Abe slowly fades out of the spotlight as he becomes less and less likable and relatable as a character. It's one of those rare phenomena in television writing where a character gets flanderized to the point of no longer being very interesting, and that ends up serving the narrative well, in that more attention is given to the rest of the ensemble as they receive more characterization to replace the vacuum of the protagonist's personality. Of course, this was all done over the course of a single 13-episode season, rather than being a result of the show running well past the point of being original, so one has to assume that it was done totally intentionally in the interest of parody. Yet another trope parodied in this episode. This time, the homely girl gets a makeover and becomes hot, revealing her to be a valid love interest all along. It comes with a mixed message where the Betty archetype is promoted for being a truer friend with a more down-to-earth personality, but only if she's attractive. In the next episode, we see JFK poke a few holes in Abe's desires during a conversation with Joan. If it takes a makeover for Abe to realize what he's missing out on, maybe he doesn't really deserve it in the first place. The unlucky everyman that is Abraham Lincoln's clone turns out to be a shallow individual, attracted only to women who are good-looking and taking his friends for granted. So many other shows will have moments like this, and it makes you wonder what TV show writers really think about their audience, to have a self-insert character be this looks-driven. Then again, pop culture is very much looks-driven in general, so it's barely even an insult to make that connection, merely an observation. Abe is shallow, the audience is likely no better. Gandhi is the type of person who ends up avoiding an unattractive Mary Curie, only to realize what he's missing later on, just as Abe is, though this comes across as less shallow and more inobservant. So in the end, the comic relief character ends up with a much stronger sense of morality than the audience surrogate. Changes. The Big Prom. The Sex Romp. The season finale. Abe finally asks Cleo to the prom, although his proposal isn't as much as he wanted it to be due to helping out Joan in the previous episode. Which works. The makeover Cleo gave her manages to attract the attention of JFK, who Joan decides to date in order to make Abe jealous. Gandhi and all the other dateless nerds rent a limo, so they can all get dates instead of going stag. But once there, Gandhi realizes how dumb he's been and asks out Mary Curie in earnest. During the actual prom, Joan makes one last attempt to win over Abe, which fails, and she has a heart-to-heart with JFK where the two actually open up to each other. Scudworth enacts his plan to become Prom King, only to once again lose to Stamos, and then, the secret board of shadowy figures crashes the party in order to abduct the clones. Stamos is able to distract the board for long enough that Scudworth is able to freeze the whole cast, and the show ends with all of the clones suspended in time. And thus ends Clone High as a show, but the legacy has only really begun. It fell out of the public's consciousness for nearly a decade, its popularity waxing only through word of mouth and the fact that it was so non-valuable to networks that they never really made a strong attempt to prevent piracy. But great shows never really lose fan, and so by now it's reached a big enough cultural impact that it can be brought back. This isn't purely because of the increase in recent popularity, though. Right now we're at a point where many networks are avoiding risk with their new programming, and as a result, revivals are much easier to sell. And finally, Phil Lord and Chris Miller are very successful writers, having done work on comedies such as 21 Jump Street, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and The Lego Movie. Despite their careers moving on, they never truly have. The same awkward teen who has to prove himself archetype that Abe fits into appears very commonly throughout their filmography, and they've mentioned in interviews that their, quote, entire career has just been about getting Clone High back on the air. There's an ample amount of untapped/unfinished potential with this series as seen in this very episode. Skyward wants to use the clones for his own purposes and turn them into a Cloney Island amusement park. But anything beyond his miniatures is never shown. How exactly he's planning on turning them into an amusement park, especially considering we've already seen an animatronic counterpart in universe, and he never really seems to goad them into entertainment. I get that it's a joke about his incompetence, but it's so overt that when the secret board of shadowy figures comes in to take the clones back, it doesn't really come across as them doing anything other than what they've been planning from the start. They're merely pushing the timetable forwards a bit, but having so many recurring celebrity guests show up for this ambush gives the impression that perhaps there was a much larger conspiracy at play all along. I'm mostly just spitballing ideas for what we might potentially see in a season 2. I know that the real reason behind most of my questions is the fact that it's a comedy. Your finale must have a bunch of guest roles returning to make it feel big. Characters take over the world because they're evil. They don't need a how or a why, that's not what the plots are about. All we do know is that much of the original creative team seems to be making a return for the second season, so the show following in its predecessor's footsteps will likely be much more than a spiritual resemblance. So many historical figures are shaped not by the circumstances of their birth, but the environment in which they were raised. Abraham Lincoln got into law as a necessity, having been inspired to fight for those who can't fight for themselves through his own impoverished childhood. His morals as a character in Clone High are often somewhat self-interested, right up until the point that somebody genuinely needs his help, at which point he drops his own interests to defend them. Gandhi spent years observing the injustices of apartheid during his studies and slowly formed his set of values as he declared that he would fight these moral atrocities. But the clone Gandhi is more of a result of his surroundings, vying for attention and affection as he has no real injustices to stand against. One can hardly compare high school cliques to occupation. And Joan of Arc's fighting against patriarchal forces and social hierarchies seem much more self-flagellating than the more legitimate inquisition her ancestor faced. But we as a species have moved so far past this state of perpetual war of the past that it's difficult to find capital G great causes to die for these days, especially for those living a comfortable middle-class suburban life. JFK has had a life free from any of the tragedies of the original Kennedys. There's a reason the line, "Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys," is a memorable punchline. Without these struggles, the clone Kennedy comes off as a much more self-made man, which ironically means that he has many of the opposite anxieties of his contemporaries. This is similar to Cleopatra's personality, living up to her ancestors' reputation as a seductress, downplaying the real historical figure's accomplishments and intelligence in favor of something that will sell ad time, much in the same way Cleo herself is objectified. But I have to admit, I am reaching far too much to make any of these comparisons. This is a show where Jack Black gets a bunch of teenagers addicted to smoking raisins, and Marilyn Manson sings about the food pyramid. It doesn't take itself nearly as seriously as I'm pretending that it does. I guess the truth of this video is the fact that I have a combined 2,500 hours across the Civilization franchise, and I just wanted to rant about cool little historical tidbits for a bit. So thank you for indulging me in that. Wesley.